computer. This is Miriam Raftery with the East County Magazine Show on KNSJ 89.1 FM Descanso. And today, my very special guest is Dave Myers, a retired sheriff's commander who is now running for sheriff after the retirement of longtime Sheriff Bill Gore. Dave Myers says it's time for a new sheriff in town to change the culture of law enforcement to one that respects everyone while assuring safe communities and rebuilding trust between residents and law enforcement. He has served in law enforcement for over 35 years. He's won awards for exceptional service and life-saving, and he's served in various nonprofits and community groups, including organizations helping at-risk youths, and led efforts to form the Sheriff's Youth Advisory Group. So Dave, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So our region and the nation have seen racial justice protests that focused on law enforcement treatment of minorities, from the use of force to racial profiling and traffic stops and so forth. Tell us how you would go about restoring trust between law enforcement and communities of color, as well as other marginalized communities.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point about restoring trust in communities. Right now, unfortunately, law enforcement, not only here locally, but across the nation, have been seen as occupiers of neighborhoods and not community members, not the peace officers that need to come in and help control crime and prevent crimes and be actual members of communities. And I think recent racial profiling studies, Center for Policing Equity published information that does send up and indicate that there is racial profiling in policing. And, you know, I think one of the priorities is to get into the communities, to embed law enforcement leadership into the communities and talk about these issues. But I think more importantly is listen to community members, and also have meaningful and robust independent community oversight groups. I think that's
Pause for a minute. Let me get rid of the call and then we'll continue with this. I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay, no problem.
Sorry, I'm going to turn the ringer off so that won't happen again. Okay, sorry.
How do you turn the ringer off on the cat?
Yeah, I'm about to. Let me just put the cat in the other room.
That's cute.
Sorry, I meant to do that. Dave, if you could just repeat the last phrase or last sentence of what you said before the phone rang.
Yeah, so it's also, I think, critical to restore community trust, to be for law enforcement leadership to be very supportive of independent community oversight.
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about crime. Obviously, a lot of people are concerned about that. Locally and nationally. You've said that you want to address the increase in violent crime. Can you tell us what steps you would take to reduce violent crime and protect public safety?
Yeah, no, we are seeing a double-digit increase in violent crimes. And, you know, I have a proven track record in my over 3 decades in law enforcement of reducing violent crimes. And law enforcement must partner with community-based organizations, anti-violence groups that are embedded in communities to address these issues. This is not strictly a law enforcement issue. Law enforcement needs to respond to these incidents of increases in violent crimes, but law enforcement must take a very active role and partner with community-based organizations, anti-gun violence programs, youth alternative programs to gang involvement. And that's where I've seen success in reducing the issues of violent crimes.
Very good. I wonder too if you could comment on what some see as a revolving door for sort of career criminals, which is a little different than the young person who's first getting in trouble. I'll give you an example of that. We just had a guy arrested in El Cajon this week for attacking an El Cajon police officer with a baseball bat, screaming, "I want to kill you." There's video of this. And this guy, it turns out, had 3 times been arrested before for violently assaulting police officers, convicted in 2 of those. And yet he was released with no jail time other than whatever time he'd served while he was awaiting trial. He got drug sentencing, was right back out, or rehab, was right back out with new drug offenses, you know, within a month. But the violence in particular is concerning. Do you think that there are any reforms needed in, you know, from a sentencing standpoint? Or, I mean, how would you handle somebody like that who has physically assaulted officers multiple times and been convicted of it.
Yeah, that the system failed. The system failed the police officer who responded and who was assaulted with the baseball bat. And the system has failed the community where this individual continues to prey on businesses and other folks. And so,
yeah, he was a shoplifter or accused of shoplifting. We should mention that was what they were called out for.
Right, exactly. And so, in not only do we need to have catches within the system, mental health treatment within the county jail system, and so on and so forth, but I also am an advocate for, again, working with community-based organizations to reduce the recidivism rate is to have the ability to work within the community once these individuals are released to where you monitor, do they have housing? Do they have wraparound medical services? Do they have access to job training? Do they need to continue in whatever is at some of the core issues of these individuals that are placed back into the community, working with probation? And the Sheriff's Department, I think, plays a major role in, let's say, at the tip of that spear, organizing these other community-based organizations to ensure success once they're released back into the community, so we can reduce the 60 to 70% recidivism rate that we're seeing today.
Okay. Let's talk about accountability now of officers themselves. It's great to have accountability for people that assault officers, but we also want accountability, presumably, for officers that have done wrongdoing themselves. You have said that the prior sheriff covered up deputy misconduct. And in fact, it's worth noting, Dave, that you were the first to raise questions about Captain Marco Garmo, who was the Rancho San Diego sheriff's captain. And ultimately, he wound up, you noted he was buying an awful lot of guns and questioned that. Nothing was done. And a few years later, he was ultimately arrested for gun trafficking and tipping off marijuana dispensaries owned by, I guess, a relative of his, so they'd be prepared for raids and things. What steps specifically would you take if you're elected sheriff to hold officers accountable when they engage in misconduct or, in Garmo's case, criminal actions?
Historically, law enforcement, when one of their own does wrong, they circle the wagons and they cut off communication. They don't tell the public what happened. They don't disclose in a very transparent manner. And we've never had any really robust community oversight to expose. I truly believe that anybody in law enforcement who violates the public trust should be held at the same standard as somebody who was not in law enforcement that is selling guns illegally, who is protecting illegal cannabis dispensaries. Deputy Richard Fisher sexually assaulted over 20 women while on duty. And you cannot sit here and tell me that his beat partners, that his supervisors didn't question where he was for certain periods of time, or that somebody had called in and said he inappropriately touched me. We must, as law enforcement leaders, admit to the shortcomings of individuals in our field and immediately deal with the issue, separate them from service if that means termination, if that means incarceration in jail, and treat them like anybody else who violates the public trust.
Let's talk about the situation in the jails. You have a sign on your wall there. I had 165 people who've died in county jail since 2009. It looks like it's gone up since then. Is it now 185?
So on February 3rd, the Joint Legislative Audit state auditors released a report on jail deaths starting in 2006. And since 2006 to 2020, there were 185. I have crossed out the 5 because there has since been 2 more jail deaths in the last month.
Okay, yeah, my data was from 2009, not 2006. Yeah, so that's shocking. And we should note this is the highest jail death rate of any major county in California. And unfortunately, our region also has by far the highest number of jail suicides. I believe it's at least 30. Dave, what is the answer in your view? What steps would you take to reduce the number of deaths of people in custody? And we should note that it's bad enough that the legislative auditor has recommended legislative action. I know the supervisors are looking at what they can do, but you'd be the top guy as sheriff, the jails would be on your watch, what would you do?
Yeah, this February 3rd report is not the first. It's
Right.
actually one of the latest out of 4 reports that were conducted over a period of about 4 or 5 years. Because 4 years ago, I was talking about the increase in jail deaths.
Right. It's long before COVID, which obviously only made it
Yes.
worse, but
And it's and just now, the current acting sheriff, Kelly Martinez, wants to do something about and address the jail deaths. To me, that's like the arsonist who set the fire and then is praised for putting it out. This issue of jail deaths has been going on for years and it's gone unaddressed. I do praise the current majority on the Board of Supervisors for accepting this latest report, the joint audit report, and putting steps forward to change legislation to work with the County Law Enforcement Review Board to update independents in their review of jail deaths. Because if you remember, back in 2014, 2015, I stood before the County Law Enforcement Review Board when they dismissed without investigating 22 jail death cases and asking them at least look at a pattern and practice of maybe a policy that is leading to this, and they didn't even do that. They just dismissed the jail death cases without even looking at it.
and we should know. I just want to interject that Kelly Martinez, whom you mentioned, is one of the candidates in the race for sheriff, and in fact, she's the one that Sheriff Gore has endorsed. So, for what that's worth, people may want to be aware of that. Go ahead.
Correct, yeah. And she has been in charge during that entire time and has been well aware of all these previous reports and has done nothing to change the pattern and practice of jail deaths. We have a plan starting to where who are we booking into jail and why are we booking them in the jail? If it's a person with underlying mental health or drug treatment issues, it's nonviolent misdemeanors, instead of spending $100,000 a year to house somebody in county jail, let's reinvent or reimagine policing by spending $20,000 to $30,000 a year on drug treatment beds in the community with professionals that know how to treat individuals with underlying mental health issues, underlying drug dependency issues. That doesn't mean these individuals are not going to be held accountable for the original reason they were arrested. We have 3 years and a day to file criminal charges, but let's treat the underlying issues that are bringing them into jails and not just allow overcrowding, which is what's happening in the county jail system right now, because the sheriff wants to open up a new jail. All right, that shouldn't be the public's goal. And then if they are in jail, let's provide just the basic medical care, mental health care, long-term drug treatment care. Let's embed mental health professionals at the onset of individuals being booked into jail to get, as the professionals, to interview these folks to see placement. And we have to separate out medical personnel and jail security professional. The deputies have to work together within a facility. What we are experiencing now is deputy sheriffs who are non-medical trained telling medical staff where to place individuals, and that is simply not working. The classification system in the jails is broken.
Very good point. You've also been somewhat outspoken on body-worn cameras for deputies, including jails. Tell us your views on that.
So outspoken, if you mean by very much in favor of it, absolutely. So 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I was charged with creating the body-worn camera program for the Sheriff's Department. At the time, I presented to Sheriff's leadership that we should definitely implement a body-worn camera program, that it should definitely be test piloted in the jails, in the field, and for deputies that work within the court system, not necessarily in a courtroom, but deputies that serve warrants and also serve eviction papers.
Yeah, good point.
And so my recommendations were adopted just for the field and not for the jails or for the court system, deputy sheriffs.
How did it work out overall in your view?
I think it's working out. I think it could be much, much better when The original reason was to create more transparency in law enforcement and what happens, yet the state legislators recently had to create a law that mandated when footage would be released to the
Yeah.
public under certain circumstances. And then what we see is law enforcement severely editing the video before they release it.
Mm.
I think the sheriff's department, and there's no reason the sheriff's department cannot have a website where full footage is downloaded onto on a daily basis.
Good point.
I want to ensure that we still protect victims, especially sexual assault and
Right.
especially domestic violence victims.
Mhm.
But there is no reason that we cannot download the video in its full extent and have it on a website that anybody can see at any time.
Good point. And how about the sheriff? You know, this is an aside, but for some reason, Sheriff Gore would never allow the release of photos of people who were arrested. And yet, you know, other law enforcement agencies routinely do that. Should that be a public record?
You know, I think it should be a public record. It is kind of a fine line, and there's a lot of discussion
Right,
on
because they haven't been convicted.
right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, individuals, just because you're arrested doesn't mean that you've been convicted of anything.
True.
yet.
On the other hand, other people might see it and go, oh, that was the person that I had on my, my doorbell cam breaking into my house last week or something. So it can go two ways. It can, I
Right.
suppose, falsely tar somebody who maybe is later found not guilty, and at the same time, it could arguably help solve other crimes, perhaps.
Absolutely, but I do agree that it is a public record.
Okay. Let's talk about another kind of public record. This one is really personal to me. Scanners. There is a new state law that requires that, I think rightly so, that private information, such as say the ID of a sexual assault victim or something, should not go out over scanner traffic. But what some law enforcement agencies have done is they've gone overboard and they've taken everything off scanner traffic. So here in San Diego, the San Diego Police Department figured out a good solution. They created a secure channel for only privacy information, and the rest of it you can still listen to. Anybody can tune in and listen on the scanner, the public, the press. The sheriff did exactly the opposite. They've taken everything onto a secure channel. So we can no longer, as media, I cannot listen anymore. We run a wildfire and emergency alert service. I can no longer tell people, oh, there's a high-speed pursuit on the freeway at 100 miles an hour, or, oh, there's an active shooter, in a park or a school or a, whatever else might be going on, unless we happen to hear about it from a concerned citizen. And I think that puts the public in danger. Would you commit? I want to hear your views on it. And I'm asking every candidate this: will they commit 100% to put that information back on public scanners, with the exception of those things that the state requires must remain private?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right about the communication. I worked for over 3 decades in the law enforcement agency and used the radio traffic, and they currently have encrypted radio channels for operations that are taking place in the field, where we don't everybody where
Exactly. Yeah, if
where
there's a
we're
SWAT
watching
team and they don't want everyone to know how they're sneaking up on the suspect, who's holding a hostage, they already put that on secure. So
Yes.
they have a way to do it. They're just choosing not to.
Yeah, so it's once again, it's a sheriff's department leadership that does not want to be transparent nor share all the information with the general public, which I think they have a right
Yeah.
and an
Martinez
ability.
could change that in a heartbeat if she wanted to, but unfortunately
Absolutely.
she hasn't. So.
Yeah. So as sheriff, absolutely. All the encrypted information based on state law should be encrypted. Everything else, there's absolutely no reason to encrypt it and to hide it from the public. And then we get back to the transparency and the issues of trust within law enforcement when in my opinion, they're hiding information.
Homelessness. I think if you ask anybody in San Diego County, they would rank homelessness as one of the biggest problems in our area. Under the prior sheriff, we've seen everything from sweeps of homeless camps, and then, courts made it more difficult to do that. And more recently, some more humane approaches going on around the county with, teams of non-law enforcement people going out to try to get help for those who need it. And yet homeless camps on the street continue to rise. I just got a response back from the county that I think most people would think was kind of inadequate. There's a homeless camp right on Magnolia, just a few feet over the city line in El Cajon. It's county property. I've been told these are sort of, I hate to use the term hardcore homeless, but the ones who've been offered help won't take it. They've threatened people, supposedly, some of the aid workers. They just had an overdose out there a couple of nights ago, according to the city manager. And yet the county's attitude is, well, we go out every now and then and kind of, you know, make sure things are clean and tidy and offer help to those that'll take it. But there's nothing being done to address the public concern about, you know, risks to the public of people are afraid to walk by it. So I guess it's a very complex thing. I mean, what would your approach be, and how might it differ from people who really need help? They're just down on their luck. Maybe they need temporary housing or job training. Those who have drug addiction or mental health issues, and then those who simply won't get help and yet, you know, might be sort of the more dangerous, you know, element within the community out there. How it's a complicated problem, but how, as sheriff, would you do your part to get help for those who really need it and get them off the streets and into a safer place, as well as protecting the public from whatever threats there might be to them?
Yeah, no, all very good points. And the homeless issue for law enforcement has been thrust upon them. You know,
Right.
it's very much a community-based issue where our local elected officials have not allocated appropriate resources to deal with those individuals that do want help, that do need housing, that do need wraparound services, job training, stress reduction, education, access to proper medical care. And so I think law enforcement should and must play a role with those individuals who take advantage of our communities and threaten others, damage property. Law enforcement plays a role there. But in my experience, that's a very, very minor role, and it's a very small percentage of
Yeah.
individuals, very small percentage.
Yeah, it's
And I
interesting
was,
that in the city of El Cajon, you don't see this stuff, and they've managed to get many hundreds of people into various programs and shelters. And you go, you know, 3 feet over the border or whatever it is into the county, which still has no shelters. They keep
right.
saying they're going to build some. They're making some progress toward it, but yeah, if the city of El Cajon can do better than this, why can't the county?
You know, and I think, and you and I know this, that the county has just seen a change in leadership at the board, and we're starting to see some of those
Yes.
changes to where the previous board had no interest in, if you will, social services and providing help as a government to
Yeah.
underserved
Well, we should
individuals.
give some kudos here. Even some of the conservatives that are on the board
Yes,
now are compassionate on this issue and have actually led the effort. I know Joel Anderson even led the effort to say, let's
yes,
do some homeless shelters and get some help for those that are willing to accept it. Whereas Diane Jacob would not do that. And of course, the progressives, you know, on the board are all for getting help for those that need it. But it takes time. And in the meantime,
yeah.
it's still kind of a sheriff dilemma of how do you deal with this?
Yeah, and so, you know, and the sheriff also needs to take ownership of, historically, the sheriff has allowed outside agencies, outside police agencies, to use the jail system for these individuals when laws are created within these municipalities to book people into jail on a very temporary basis. They don't
Mhm.
have bail money, so they have to stay in custody for periods of time. And
Mhm.
COVID extended that. And I call that displacement, and that solves no problems. That solves no issues for any community long term, and it just exacerbates the problem. And so, you know, the sheriff created a homeless outreach team of 5 or 6 deputy sheriffs for a county of 4,200 square miles. That is an absolute joke.
Yeah.
That tells me that there is no real buy-in to what the issues are. I think if the sheriff created an internal unit where the sheriff's department in coordination, once again, with these mobile crisis response teams that are being created, and I don't think an armed response is necessary to go out and help educate individuals on resources to get them off the streets.
Correct. Yeah.
There are incidents in which armed, fully sworn deputy sheriffs need to respond because true criminal activity is occurring, but that's
Right,
a
like the
very
guy with the
small,
baseball bat. I don't know if
yeah,
he's
yeah,
homeless or not, but that's an example. But you're
yeah.
right. Most of the time, it's just somebody who's down on their luck and somebody's complaining about, trash on the sidewalk or
Right.
something like that. That really is, yeah, there's probably a better approach to somebody who just
Yes.
needs help than
Yes.
putting them in jail.
Correct.
Um, you mentioned about not enough deputies, and it reminded me of another pet peeve of many people in East County, but that is when you get out in these rural areas. A few years ago, we did a records request on response times, and it was abysmally slow in places like, Campo and Boulevard and Hacumba. Some of these people were waiting an average of an hour for even the most violent things. I see somebody being stabbed next door, and it would take an hour for a response. They often would call the border patrol first, even though it's not their jurisdiction, because they knew somebody would show up fast if they made that call. Would you commit to fight for more resources to get more deputies stationed out there so they're not at home and getting a call in the middle of the night when something violent? I realize, they can't maybe be there for every little thing, but certainly for violent crimes, shouldn't we be able to do better for people in every part of the county?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And I used to be a lieutenant in the backcountry in the rural division, and I did fight for more deputy sheriffs in the rural division, even to the point where I submitted a federal grant so that I can at least get deputy sheriffs on overtime working in the rural area, especially along the international border. We need to, as sheriff, advocate for more resources in our rural communities because things go on after dark out there. When our rural deputies who are home and who are asleep, not very many people know that we don't have 24-hour, 7-day-a-week coverage in the backcountry.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that we can do better. And I know with more deputy sheriffs that we can provide the coverage and dramatically reduce the response times.
Okay, so it sounds like you might be a stronger advocate before the supervisors to get funding for those rural deputies.
Yes.
Um, let's talk about young people. Dave, you have a lot of experience working with young people to keep them out of trouble, as we've previously mentioned. What more would you do if you're sheriff to help, to help prevent them from going down sort of the school to prison pipeline, so to
Yes.
speak?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And law enforcement has a lot of discretion in dealing with youth and dealing with those under the age of 18 who might get criminal justice involvement. And I think right now, the path has been juvenile justice involvement first, and then try and figure out other paths for them afterwards. What I want to do is I want to embed the restorative justice process at the beginning of that, at the front end of the juvenile justice involvement process, at least within the sheriff's department.
So for people who
So,
don't know what restorative justice means, can you explain that?
yeah. So it's essentially community-based. If you've ever heard the saying, it takes a village. So, and I'll give you an example of one I specifically was involved in. A young kid, freshman at high school, was involved in stealing a loaf of bread from a local 7-Eleven in Lakeside. I get called as a deputy sheriff. Usually the protocol is, okay, we arrest you, we take you to juvenile hall. But then I got to talking with the kid. Why aren't you in school? You've been truant. Okay, let's go home, figure out what's going on there. The mother had underlying mental health issues, couldn't work. There were no beds in the house. There was a small brother that lived there.
Oh my gosh.
It was unkempt. There was no food in the refrigerator. So the kid was just trying to feed his family. The
Just
kid
hungry,
was trying
yeah.
to be the family. So I thought, okay, this is ridiculous. So I got a local church involved. I got local neighborhood watch group involved. I got the
Good for
school
you.
involved. So we got food in the refrigerator. We got beds with clean sheets in the bedrooms. We got the
Nice.
mother a program to where she cleaned herself up. We got her a part-time job.
Wow.
The kid was in school every single day. The kid graduated high school and went on to college.
Wow.
And it was not just me. I mean, it was the community involvement. It was the restorative process. And the kid does not have a criminal record because we also got 7-Eleven involved.
So they don't.
That,
Yeah.
yeah, so that we could have a success story. And so,
That's a great story. We need, I think, a lot more of that, Dave.
right,
My
right, right.
opinion.
And it
But
was that's the restorative process. That's where everybody buys into how can we make our community better. And if we all pitch in, this is how we do it. There was no political affiliations. There was a conversation about how can we make this family successful.
yeah, no, that's great. Let's talk about another problem that's a problem nationally, but also locally, and that is the rise of hate groups, extremist groups, specifically white supremacy groups. Um, the Southern California or the Southern Poverty Law Center just did its latest report, which identified yet more hate groups in our area. And I will say that, Dave, through the years, it seems like even when an attack is caught on video, nothing happens to those who were responsible. I can tell you that our media outlet has had reporters threatened and even assaulted by, sort of racist white supremacist types out here. We've published videos of some of these folks assaulting young people of color who were doing nothing more than standing there with a sign, clearly showed the faces of the assailants, even when this was brought to the attention of law enforcement, when people let them know about it. Nothing happened. They never reached out to us. They never, I should say, La Mesa police did when it occurred in La Mesa, but in the sheriff's jurisdiction, it just seemed like nothing's happened. And yet they would go and arrest,
You've reached the offices.
young people of color who were, 1 minute past curfew at these protests and do nothing about the people who were assaulting them. What will it take, Dave? I know this is an issue that concerns you, but how do you get the law enforcement officers in communities like Santee and Lakeside that seem to be sort of hotbeds for these groups to take this seriously? And while everybody has a right to protest and state their views, even if they offend people, there's something very different from, wearing a sign or putting a mask on your face with some message versus actually beating people up in the streets. How would you address this problem, including the lack of responsiveness, frankly, by some of the law enforcement folks out there?
Yeah, the FBI has identified white supremacy, white nationalism as the greatest domestic threat. And I've seen it. I've seen it here in San Diego County.
Mhm.
I spent a lot of years addressing it within the county sheriff's department and within the county of San Diego, not just some East County areas, but all parts of San Diego
Yeah,
County.
it's in North County and other
Yeah,
areas.
that's-
I'm familiar with what happens here, but I've certainly
Yeah.
read about pockets of it in many other
I'm
parts of the county.
I am absolutely committed to putting the same emphasis, the same staffing, probably even more creating a special unit of detectives over and above those committed to Black and brown gangs to addressing the white nationalists and white extremists. I've seen it here in San Diego. I attended some of those La Mesa events. I saw some of the Proud Boys that I don't like to mention their names because I don't want to highlight who they are,
Mhm.
but they showed up at protests, Black Lives Matter protests, carrying large knives on their belts.
Mhm.
And I pointed it out to La Mesa officers and they just kind of shrugged it off.
I
They
know,
would
we've got pictures of it. Mhm.
they wouldn't let me carry a big stick on my sign, but they allowed these individuals into the protest area with these large knives on their belt. I do know that there are within law enforcement in San Diego County white supremacists and white extremists.
Yeah, I wonder, do we need maybe more people of color on the force, particularly assigned to the places that have been hotbeds for this kind of a problem, as opposed
And
to,
I think we
all
need
white
to have
folks?
we need to have in law enforcement a very robust program to where we monitor our own. The January 6th insurrection at the US Capitol, it's very well documented that lots of officers who are off duty and military that were off duty were there participating in an insurrection against our US Capitol.
Do we know if any of those were local, especially from the sheriff department?
I have not heard of any that participated in the actual event itself, but I have heard that there are individuals that supported it. And you also La Prensa recently published a Deputy Sheriff's Association survey that has 32 pages of comments from deputy sheriffs, and they're very supportive of the former Oath Keeper sheriff in Riverside County, Sheriff Bianco. And so there are sympathizers I know currently within the sheriff's department.
Let's talk about guns, another sort of hot button issue. Dave, you have taken a fairly moderate stance on this one. I know when you ran for sheriff in the past, you actually were endorsed by the San Diego Gun Owners Association for taking a moderate position on issues like concealed carry permits, saying that Sheriff Gore wasn't doing enough to, allow the issuance of those. But you've also been outspoken on the need to crack down on things like ghost guns. So I guess I'm just going to leave this open-ended and ask you, what would you like our listeners and on our website, our readers, to know about your views on where you would draw the balance between protecting Second Amendment rights versus reducing gun violence, which is, at an alarming rate in our country?
Yeah, I myself have been the victim of gun violence, where I've been shot at by a security guard, and I've had a gun held to my head and the trigger pulled, but thankfully the bullet was bad and didn't go off.
Oh my
So
gosh.
I know about gun violence. I know about gun violence against our law enforcement in the fields, and there are too many people that have access to guns. The issue of ghost guns, there should be no gun that law enforcement cannot trace through a serial number that's on the streets. And
Yeah, those are homemade guns
Yes.
that very often criminals use because they can't legally go buy one. So they're making their own now with parts off of the internet, for people that aren't familiar with the term.
Yeah, I'm as sheriff, I am absolutely committed to enforcing the law when it comes to concealed carry permits issued by the sheriff.
Mhm.
I think the policy that I put forward 4 years ago, I still stand by today. The sheriff gets to do a complete and thorough background check on anybody that wants to carry a concealed carry weapon. Then you have to go to the sheriff's range and demonstrate proficiency in that firearm. So
Mhm.
I think that's a win-win for the community. I think people need to, responsible gun owners need to ensure that their guns are safely locked up so they're not getting stolen, and access to those guns by individuals that should not have them. I am absolutely a supporter of the Second Amendment, the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, the Eighth Amendment, all of them.
All of them.
Very critical that we support that. But the fact that individuals that should not have access guns that do, I think law enforcement needs to step up its enforcement on the violence associated with gun violence.
Thank you for that. Tell us about who your major endorsements are. I see you've got some, across the board, but who are some of the endorsements that you're most proud of in this race, Dave?
I'm actually absolutely proud of every single one of them. The one I'm most proud of is my mother, who has been out supporting me from day one and is very involved in it. I am supported by Congress members Mike Levin and Sarah Jacobs. I'm supported by current La Mesa Council member Bill Baber and Mayor Arapastathis in La Mesa, and across the board.
Some cross-party line endorsements there, and at least with Mr. Baber and Councilman Baber, and
and across the county of San Diego, from Imperial Beach, National City, Chula Vista, up to Vista, Encinitas, Carlsbad. And so we have a very, very broad swath of endorsements. The San Diego County Democratic Party overwhelmingly supported me. Because they understand, and those who endorse me understand, that we need a change in law enforcement in the San Diego Sheriff's Department, one that does not include a conversation of defunding. I have never supported any conversations of defunding anybody, but I truly believe that law enforcement must reimagine policing. We must get a handle on the double-digit crime increases, and I have a proven track record of reducing crimes in neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think we all want someone to answer when we call 911, but it's a matter of using the money wisely, as you say, not defunding it, but making sure that it's used in the most appropriate ways and that everybody's accountable. Um, Listeners, we are speaking with Dave Myers. He is a retired sheriff commander and one of the leading candidates in the race for San Diego County Sheriff, which is an open seat after the retirement of former Sheriff Bill Gore. The primary election is coming up the first Tuesday in June, and if nobody gets more than 50%, as I understand it, there would be a runoff in November. Is that correct in this race, Dave?
So if you remember, unlike last time, this is the first time Measure D, which was passed by the voters in 2018, will be implemented. So regardless of if anybody gets 50% plus one, the top two must go to a general.
Right. Okay. Okay. So you're hoping to be in that top two. Dave, I want to ask, is there what you view as the biggest contrast between yourself and the other major candidates running that you'd like folks to know about? And what's your strategy to win the election, or at least make it for now into the top two in June?
Yeah, no, very good question. I have a proven track record of results. I have a proven track record of reducing violent crimes because I've implemented strategies that work. We must stop the jail deaths. I am not afraid to take on the status quo, to change, to make things better, to be transparent, and to be accountable to the public. I will engage the communities all over the county of San Diego. We will address issues and we will listen to communities because it's what law enforcement is supposed to be. I want to restore the competency within the ranks of the sheriff's department at all ranks, at all levels, amongst all classifications. Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you, Dave, for joining us. I want to ask if you have any parting thoughts and where people can find more information about your campaign or get involved.
So our campaign, you can find it on our website, www.davemyers, sheriff.com. Again, all one word, Dave Myers for sheriff.com. We're on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Follow us, sign up to help out, and learn more about our campaign.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us today on the East County Magazine radio show on KNSJ 89.1 FM Descanso, the network for social justice.